Deep in the Vienna woods in Austria, on the morning of the 30th of January 1889, in the Imperial Hunting Lodge of Mayerling, the bodies of 30-year-old Crown Prince Rudolf and his 17-year-old lover, Baroness Mary Betsera, were found dead in his bedroom under mysterious circumstances. He had arranged for a day's shooting early in the morning of the 30th, but when his valet, Loschek, went to call him, there was no answer. Count Joseph Hoyas and Prince Philip, two of the Crown Prince's hunting companions, were called, but they as well could get no response from the knocking on the door. They tried to force it open, but it was locked. Finally, they were able to get the door open, having broken through one of the panels with a hammer and reaching inside to turn the key in the lock and gain entry. The valet was the only one to enter the room, which he found with the shutters closed, and it was half dark inside. The scene that was discovered was a tragic one. Rudolf was found slumped on the floor motionless by the side of the bed, leaning forward and bleeding from his head onto the carpet. On the bed lay the dead body of Maria Betsera, his mistress. Beside him on the bedside table was an empty glass. Without a closer look in the poor light, Loschek assumed that the Crown Prince had drunk poison from the glass, since he knew strychnine caused bleeding. Both had been dead for some hours. Loschek said to the two guests that the Crown Prince was lying with a pool of blood in front of him, and both he and the Baroness were dead. For some reason neither Prince Philip or Count Hoyas entered the bedroom. Loschek said he thought Rudolf had died by taking cyanide of potassium. He could not have looked very closely, for half of Rudolf's skull had been blown off by a bullet fired at close range. The prince was married in 1881 to the then 15-year-old Princess Stephanie of Belgium, the daughter of Leopold II. He was the heir and only son and heir apparent to the throne of the Emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Franz Joseph. The princess had little education, a hot temper, and a stubborn will. Since the marriage was brought about for political reasons, Rudolf, with his keen sense of the obligations of royalty, learned to regard her with tolerance and affection. Doting on the daughter she gave him 2 years after their marriage. He was continually having affairs with women, notably with a pretty dancer, Mitzi Kasper, who was happy to return his affection, while at the same time acting as a police spy and an agent of the German government. To close friends, Rudolf sometimes confessed that his marriage to the Belgian princess was a burden to him. His death interrupted the line of succession, which would lead to long-term implications across Europe. Many people at the imperial court, including Rudolf's parents and his wife Stephanie, knew that he and Mary were having an affair. His marriage was not a particularly happy one, and had resulted in the birth of only one child, a daughter called Elizabeth. Rudolf had also infected his wife with syphilis, rendering her unable to have any more children. Early in November 1888, 3 months before his death, Rudolf had met the young Baroness Maria Betsera for the first time. The affair progressed, and there were occasional but regular meetings, and Rudolf continued to see Mitzi Kasper. He went hunting, attended court functions, and visited his wife frequently. On November the 19th, he took a fall from his horse and was badly shaken up, complaining of frequent headaches and stomach trouble for a few days, but he seemed to recover quickly. On December the 11th, a new production opened at the Vienna Opera. He did not attend. Instead, there was a secret rendezvous with Maria Betsera. He spent Christmas with his family at court. On January the 13th, he had seduced Betsera. In honour of the occasion, he gave her an iron ring, to be worn on a chain around her neck. Inside the ring were engraved the words, "In love united until death." Such rings with exactly similar inscriptions were familiar gifts among young lovers in Vienna. Pretty much everyone at the imperial court knew that Rudolph and Mary were having an affair, even his parents and his wife, Stephanie. He spent the night with Mitzi Casper, and the next day he went to Mayerling, where he was joined by Vetsera. He arranged a hunting party at the lodge, which he had purchased 3 years earlier. His parties were unconventional, having casual dress code, minimal decorations, and informal conversation. After the grim discovery, it was decided that Count Hoyas should waste no time, and he rushed to the station to take a train back to Vienna. He hurried to the Emperor's Adjutant General Parr and requested he break the news to the Emperor. Parr protested that only the Empress could break such catastrophic news. Baron Nopska, controller of the Empress's household, was summoned. He, in turn, sent for Ida Ferenzi, Empress Elizabeth's lady-in-waiting, to determine how Her Imperial Majesty should be informed. She was at her Greek lesson and was impatient at the interruption. Ferenzi announced that Baron Nopska had grave news about the Crown Prince. Elizabeth was distraught and weeping uncontrollably as the Emperor appeared at her apartments. The Empress broke the terrible news to her husband in private. The Minister for Police was summoned, and the National Security Services sealed off the Imperial Hunting Lodge and the surrounding area. Immediately after, the Imperial family tried to hush up the scandal. The Medical Commission arrived in Mayerling that afternoon and established a more accurate cause of death, and made their report to the Emperor the following morning. Suicide letters were discovered alongside the bodies. The court physician, Dr. Hermann von Weiderhofer, reported that Rudolph had been killed instantly by the bullet and suffered no pain. The Emperor was thunderstruck and was told that Rudolph had apparently shot Maria Vetsera and later turned the revolver on himself. The Emperor collapsed on the floor in grief. A statement was issued at noon on behalf of the Emperor that Rudolph had died due to a heart attack. There were those in the imperial family and imperial court who were still under the impression that he had been poisoned. The family attempted to state that Maria had died on her way to Venice, and her uncles propped up her body with a broomstick to cover up the double suicide as they left the lodge. Vetsera was quickly buried, and the court refused to let her mother see her daughter's grave for over 2 months after the interment. Due to the Emperor's orders, there began the long, arduous and dangerous path of concealing the evidence. Documents connected with the case were impounded and kept in secret files. Most of the farewell letters vanished, and those that were eventually published, either in full or in part, are not completely convincing. Crown Princess Stephanie published what was purported to be Rudolph's last letter to her. Dear Stephanie, you are relieved of my presence and vexations. Be happy in your own way. Be kind to the poor little one, who is all that remains to me. I go calmly to my death, which alone can save my good name. I embrace you warmly, your loving Rudolph. This was the only one of his letters to be published in full, and it raises more questions than it answers. Mary Vetsera's letters were of the same kind. To her mother she wrote, Dear mother, forgive me what I have done. I could not resist my love. In agreement with him, I desire to be buried beside him at Alland. I am happier in death than in life. These letters do not offer incontrovertible proof that Rudolf shot Maria and then shot himself. It was a time when the forgery of letters had been elevated into a fine art, especially in the secret chanceries of state. There were men in high positions who wanted to get rid of Rudolf for his liberal opinions. They would think nothing of concocting a handful of forged letters. We know that some of the official documents concerning the scandal were doctored, and that the most important ones were never published. Hoyos wrote a lengthy account of the events leading up to the tragedy, and his report sometimes gives the impression of being a hurried and desperate improvisation. Someone, perhaps many people, were lying. Count Hoyos, Locek, and Prince Philip all acted strangely, and they seemed to know far more about the deaths in the hunting lodge than they ever admitted. Inevitably, theories proliferated. There were those who believed that Rudolf was murdered by a jealous husband. Others thought the prince killed the Baroness accidentally and then killed himself in remorse. The official Gazette of Vienna still reported the original story that day. His Royal Highness and Imperial Highness Crown Prince Archduke Rudolf died yesterday at his hunting lodge at Meerling, near Baden, from the rupture of an aneurysm of the heart. They also attempted to state that Vetsera had died on her way to Venice. Foreign correspondents descended on Meerling and soon learned that Rudolf's mistress was implicated in his death. This first official version of a heart attack was quickly dropped, and it was announced that the Crown Prince had first shot the Baroness in a suicide pact and sat by her body for several hours before shooting himself. Rudolf and the Emperor were known to have recently had a violent argument, with Franz Joseph demanding that his son end the liaison with his teenage mistress. The police closed their investigations with surprising haste, in apparent response to the Emperor's wishes. Franz Joseph did everything in his power to get the Church's blessing for Rudolf's burial in the imperial crypt. This would have been impossible had the Crown Prince deliberately committed murder and suicide. The Vatican issued a special dispensation, declaring that Rudolf had been in a state of mental imbalance, and he now lies with 137 other Habsburgs in the imperial crypt of the Church of the Capuchins in Vienna. Rudolf had requested in his farewell note to his mother that he be buried next to Mary Vetsera in Alland. Elizabeth was haunted by this and visited the crypt, hoping that Rudolf's spirit would visit her and communicate his wishes. The death caused a dynastic crisis. As Rudolf was the only son of Franz Joseph, the emperor's brother, Karl Ludwig, became heir apparent to Austria-Hungary. He renounced his succession rights a few days later in favour of his eldest son, Franz Ferdinand. In July 2015, the Austrian National Library published copies of Vetsera's letters of farewell to her mother and other family members. These letters, previously believed to be lost or destroyed, were found in a safety deposit box in an Austrian bank, where they'd been placed in 1926. They were written in Meerling shortly before the deaths, and state clearly and unambiguously that Vetsera was preparing to commit suicide alongside Rudolf. Historians agree that Rudolf had first proposed a double suicide to a prominent courtesan, Mitzi Kasper. It was after she refused that Rudolf proposed the death pact with the more susceptible Vetsera. It was known at the time that Rudolf was a poetic man who brooded a lot. He was ill with syphilis and felt guilty that he had infected his wife. He became more unstable over the course of his marriage and various affairs, offering the suicide pact to a number of people. Vetsera was only 17, and knowing that she could never live without Rudolf, leading to the joint suicide, with her lover killing her several hours before killing himself. With the death of the Crown Prince, there died the last hope for a new and enlightened monarchy. For more than a quarter of a century, Emperor Franz Joseph continued to rule without any knowledge of the real issues at stake. He cared deeply for the formal observance of court etiquette, and seemed to care for nothing else. Once a year, on the anniversary of Rudolf's death, he would appear briefly beside his son's tomb, mutter a prayer, and then hurry away. At court, no one was ever permitted to mention Rudolf's name, and the emperor instructed the police to close investigations quickly, stating that the deaths happened when the balance of Rudolf's mind was disturbed. Franz Joseph had been the reigning emperor of Austria-Hungary in 1889, an empire of myriad ethnic and national groups, many of whom wanted their own nation-states. He would not give them independence, instead allying the empire with Germany. Before his death, Rudolf, heir to the throne, sympathised with those wanting their independence, and even had liberal political views in opposition to the notoriously conservative emperor, his father, and he didn't want to get too close to Germany. The destabilisation of the Habsburg dynastic succession, caused by the death of Rudolf, endangered the growing reconciliation between the Austrian and Hungarian factions. After acceding to the throne in 1914, the conservative and maniacal Emperor Franz Ferdinand and his wife were gunned down in Sarajevo by a Slav nationalist called Gavrilo Princip in June. The assassination precipitated what became known as the July Crisis, which led to Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia, which in turn led to the start of the First World War.